Hi again, boys and girls. This is another video for you on decimals. This time we are looking at dividing decimals by 10, okay? So let's get started. So if you remember the other day, we looked whenever we were multiplying decimals by 10 at how important it was to have our column headings. Now, that is equally important today to have our column headings, to have them all written, our thousands, our hundreds, tens, units, decimal point, tenths and hundredths. Okay? Now, today's rule with our decimals is when we are dividing them, the numbers will get smaller each time. When we multiplied, the numbers got bigger, and therefore they moved to the left of our columns. They moved up towards the bigger numbers. Today, when we are dividing decimals by 10, they are still moving one column, but this time they are moving one column to the right. So let's look at a first example. If we take the number 5.3 and we divide that by 10, again, in a normal dividing sum, we'd do our L shape, our bed sum, and we'd fill our numbers in around that. But today, because we're dividing by 10, and because it's a decimal, we are learning that it moves one column to the right. So let's try this one together. We have our 5.3, and put a decimal point beneath it. And as I said, the numbers now will get smaller, so they'll move one column to the right. So the 3 in the tenths goes into the hundredths, the 5 in the units goes into the tenths, and this is where some people get a little bit confused. The fact now we have a decimal point 53, if there is no number to the left of that decimal point, you can imagine if there was a 0 there. That doesn't change the value of the 5.3, but it does let me now have a 0 beside the decimal point. So look at your answer line. We have 5.3 divided by 10 equals 0.53. Okay? Let's try a second one here. So this time we're going to have a slightly bigger number. We're going to have 12.9, and we're going to divide 12.9 by 10. So just like before, important thing remember is your column headings. Let's get those written onto your board or your piece of paper or whatever it is that you have today that you're working on. And we have 12.9, making sure they're all written into the correct columns again. Decimal point on my answer line. And what we're doing, yes, we are moving the numbers one column to the right again. So it's getting smaller. So the tenths goes to the hundredths. The 2 in the units goes to the tenths. The 1 in tens goes to the units. And that gives me an answer of when 12.9 is divided by 10, 1.29. Well done. Now it does not matter how big the number is, they all follow the same rules and they all move the same way. We talked yesterday about how they're like a train and all the carriages are joined together, so the numbers never swap around. The carriages never just decide to change position. They are linked, but they can move up and down the track. They can move up and down the columns together. So if I had a bigger number today, so let's look at 486.7. A bigger number, and divide that by 10. Well, first thing I need to do again is to write that into the correct columns. 486.7. Put my decimal point on my answer line, and I begin the process then of moving everything one column to the right. So the 7 goes from the tenths to the hundredths. The 6 goes from the units to the tenths. The 8 goes from the tens to the units. And the 4 goes from the hundreds to the tens. So 486.1 divided by 10 equals 48.67. Here are some examples that I put up. There are 5 here. So if you want to have a go at these yourself now on your page or on a whiteboard to try and figure out the answers, well then just pause the video here, and whenever you hit play again, whenever you're ready, you'll see we'll solve these together on the right hand side, and you can check to see whether you have got the correct answer. Okay, so we'll start with number 1. So again, pause it if you haven't got your answers down yet. And the first thing I'm going to need to put in here is my tens, my units, my tenths, and my hundredths. And I'm going to put in 3.9. Now, decimal point. Dividing that by 10, look at the big blue box at the top, the blue writing at the top. Move the numbers one column to the right. The 9 goes from the tenths into the hundredths. The 3 goes from the units into the tenth. Remember, hops across the decimal point. And I can't have 0.39 as my answer, I need to have a number in the placeholder column of the units. And again, as I said before, whether or not you need to put a 0 up there to put it across, or whether you just remember to put a 0 there for your answer, 0.39 is what you should come up with. For our second example, we have 14.5 divided by 10, and I've written that in already, so we have our decimal point, and once again, we move the numbers one column to the right to make them smaller. So remember, if you end up with a bigger number than what you're starting with, you've done it wrong, you've moved in the wrong way. It has to be a smaller number. So the 5 goes from the tenths to the hundredths, the 4 from the units to the tenths, and the 1 goes from the tens to the units column. So 14.5 divided by 10 equals 1.45. Our third example is probably actually the one that will cause you most difficulty, because people will look at it and think to themselves, maybe that doesn't look quite right, and they're not sure sometimes what a smaller number than 0.6 looks like. But if we look at it together, let's put our decimal point in, and again we're moving the numbers one column to the right to make them smaller. The 6 goes from the tenth to the hundredths. Make it into 6, there you are. The 0 goes from the units to the tenths. Now don't be confused by the fact again that there's nothing in the units column. Once again, a number needs to go there. If it is blank, you can put either a 0 there just before you do anything else, or up on your first line you can put a 0 in the tens column, and you can show that being moved across. So 0.6 divided by 10 equals 0.06. That's our answer. Example number 4, we have 177.2. So we'll put a decimal point in there. And again, if you have your answer at home, just you check it is right as we go along. The 2 goes from the tenths to the hundredths. The 7 goes from the units to the tenths. Oh, that's a 7. The other 7 goes from the tens to the units. And the 1 goes from the hundreds to the tens. So 177.2 divided by 10 equals 17.72. Now hopefully, as we said yesterday when we were multiplying by 10, you can start to see patterns emerging in what the answers look like compared to the number you're starting with. And then make it get to the stage where you maybe do not need to use the arrows as much, but it is always good practice for now to put them in just to make sure you have the right answer at the end. Now this last example that we're looking at is a little bit different to the others. I wonder if you can spot why it is different. Well, in fact, it is different because we know that we move the numbers one column to the right when we're dividing by 10, but the column that we have gone as far as in our decimals is we've had our T for tenths and our H for hundredths. We have just ended there, so as far as we're aware, there's no columns after that. Well, that is incorrect. There's lots of columns after that, and I just wanted to show you in this last example that sometimes the number will be even smaller than what we've got up to. So we have a small T for tenths, a small H for hundredths, and when we have a T and an H together, that is our thousandths column. Now you won't come across it that much, but it was just in case you're looking at that thinking to yourself, I wonder what would happen if there was a number in the hundreds and I had to make it smaller. What would I do? Well, decimal point, 4 goes from the hundredths to the thousandths, 3 goes from the tenths to the hundredths, and the 8 goes from the units to the tenths. And again, there's nothing in my units placeholder there, so I can add a 0. So in fact, it looks like a really small number, or a really different number than what we were used to seeing, and you might look at it thinking, that doesn't look quite right. But the answer to 8.34 divided by 10 equals 0.834. Well done. Look, I'm sure you've been working really, really hard. You've been listening really carefully to the video that we've been going through here. You've been doing the examples, and I'm hoping that you have been getting them all right. Hopefully, guys, when you go and do your page of work, you'll continue to remember that you're moving the numbers, one column to the right, and you won't get too confused. It is the opposite of what we do when we're multiplying. So look, have a go, give it your best shot, send it in to me, and I'll mark it and send it back to you. Bye now.